welcome back to the Cine Flux. If you are here for the first time, I am genuinely glad you found us. And if you have been here before, you already know what kind of space this is. This is not the place where someone reads you a plot summary and calls it a review. This is the place where we sit with a film the way you sit with a piece of music that has followed you home, slowly, carefully, letting it mean something. Today, the film we are sitting with is one that carries enormous ambition and real emotional weight. And yet, and this is the part I want to be honest with you about from the very beginning, it does not quite arrive where it is reaching. War for the Planet of the Apes arrived in 2017 with a heavy crown on its head and a story to tell about survival, dignity, and what it costs to lead. I have thought about this film for a long time. I keep returning to it, not because it overwhelmed me, but because it is so close to greatness, that the distance it falls short feels worth understanding. So let us begin there. Let us begin with what this film was trying to be. To understand War for the Planet of the Apes, you need to understand the extraordinary pressure it arrived under. The year was 2017. The planet, in both the literal and metaphorical sense, felt like it was at war with itself, politically, socially, environmentally. The headlines of that period read like dispatches from the edge of something irreversible. In the United States, a new and deeply divisive presidency had just begun. Across the world, conversations about borders, identity, and who deserves refuge were not abstract debates, they were the daily texture of public life. Migration crises were reshaping Europe. Authoritarianism was rising in places where people had not expected to see it rise again. And meanwhile, cinema, always the mirror of its moment, whether it intends to be or not, was finding new ways to ask old questions. What makes a civilization? Who counts as human? And what does a species do when it turns its power against the most vulnerable among its own? The Planet of the Apes franchise had always been a parable machine. Since the original 1968 film, directed by Franklin J. Schaffner and based on Pierre Boulez's novel, the series had used the conceit of an ape-dominated world as a way to hold a mirror to humanity, its racism, its arrogance, its cycles of domination and rebellion. The franchise had been dormant for years when Rise of the Planet of the Apes arrived in 2011 and did something no one quite expected. It made you cry for chimpanzee. It was a genuine achievement, both scientifically curious and emotionally generous, and it introduced the world to Caesar, the ape leader whose intelligence, grief, and dignity would carry the entire rebooted trilogy. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes followed in 2014 and deepened everything. It was a study in the fragility of peace, the way trauma and fear can undo even the most carefully built bridges between two peoples. By the time Dawn arrived, critics and audiences were united in something rare, the shared recognition that this was prestige cinema wearing the clothes of a blockbuster franchise. War then was not just the conclusion of a story, it was the conclusion of a statement. It was being asked to carry the full weight of everything the two films before it had built: the grief of a father, the cost of leadership, the question of whether a species defined by violence can ever truly change, and deliver a finale that felt worthy of all of it. The film arrived in July of 2017 into an atmosphere of genuine anticipation. The critical reception was strong, hovering in the mid to high 80s on most aggregated review platforms, with many critics hailing it as a sober, weighty, emotionally serious piece of filmmaking. Odd Season recognized it modestly. It received recognition for its visual effects, which are genuinely extraordinary, and Michael Giacchino's score earned particular praise. But the largest awards, the ones that might have elevated the conversation about what this trilogy had actually accomplished, largely passed it by. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences has a long and complicated history with genre filmmaking, and this was yet another example of a film that worked harder than most prestige dramas to earn its emotional register and received less formal acknowledgement for it. What is interesting is that the audience response, while broadly positive, was subtler than the critical one. Box office performance was solid but not spectacular. The film grossed over $490 million worldwide, which was a healthy number for a summer release, but it underperformed the previous entry in the franchise by a meaningful margin. There was a sense, reading audience responses from that period, that some people came in expecting one kind of film and found another. The title promised war. The marketing promised spectacle. What the film delivered was something slower, more interior, more interested in silence and suffering than in the kinetic energy the word war implies. That gap between expectation and experience is something we will come back to, because it tells us something important about what this film genuinely is and what it was perhaps unwisely sold as. In the years since its release, War for the Planet of the Apes has found a second life on streaming platforms, particularly through the Disney and later Hulu ecosystems, where it is often discovered in sequence by people working through the full trilogy. And in that context, separated from the marketing pressure and the summer release window, the film lands differently. Viewers who come to it having just finished Rise and Dawn bring the right emotional luggage. They know Caesar, they have lived with him, and that knowledge changes everything about how the final chapter reads. There is a growing sense in the critical community, revisiting this film in the context of its streaming life, that it was perhaps underappreciated in its theatrical moment, that its quietness was mistaken for emptiness, when in fact it is something more considered than that. I am not entirely sure I agree with that reassessment, but I understand why it exists. What I am certain of is this: War for the Planet of the Apes is a film that deserves to be taken seriously, not because it succeeds at everything it attempts, but because what it attempts matters. It is a film about the price of hatred, not other people's hatred, but your own. It is a film about a leader who has built his entire identity on being better than the thing that made him, and what happens when that identity begins to crack under the weight of everything he has lost. It is also, and this is the part that the cultural moment of 2017 gave particular resonance to, a film about a people who are systematically dehumanized, imprisoned, forced to build walls for the very power that seeks to destroy them, and who find ways to hold on to their dignity anyway. Think about what that means in the context of the world that was watching it. Think about the images on the news that year. And think about the fact that this film chose to tell the story through characters who are literally not human. Because sometimes the most honest mirror is the one that does not reflect your face directly. This is the word War for the Planet of the Apes was born into, a word at the edge of something, a word looking for stories that could hold the weight of what it was killing. Whether the film fully rises to that challenge, that is what this essay is about. So let us talk about what this film actually is. War for the Planet of the Apes was directed by Matt Reeves, the filmmaker who had taken over the franchise from Rupert Wyatt after Rise and delivered the remarkably assured Dawn in 2000 featured. Reeves is a director with a very particular set of instincts. He is drawn to scale, to the kind of images that remind you cinema is a physical sensory art form, but he is equally drawn to restraint. His camera tends to hold rather than cut. His frames breathe. He is deeply interested in the space between action and reaction, and he trusts that the most important thing happening in a scene is usually not the loudest thing. These instincts made Dawn of the Planet of the Apes one of the finest genre films of the 21st century so far, and they are everywhere in War as well. The difference is that in War, those instincts are pushed further toward quietness, further toward interiority, further toward a pace that asks a great deal of its audience's patience. The film was produced by Peter Chernin and Dylan Clark, the team who had shepherded the trilogy from its beginning, and written by Reeves himself alongside Mark Pombach, who had co-written Dawn. It stars Andy Serkis as Caesar, the performance capture artist whose work in this trilogy represents one of the most significant and most under-acknowledged achievements in modern cinema. Alongside him are Woody Harrelson as a military commander known only as the Colonel, Steve Zahn as a new character called Bad App, and Amaya Miller as a young human girl named Nova. The film also features the returning presence of Karin Konoval as the orangutan Morris, Terry Notary as Flockett, and Michael Adamthwaite as Luca Apes, who had been with Caesar since the beginning and whose loyalty to him feels genuinely earned across three films. Tonally, War for the Planet of the Apes is a war film the way Apocalypse Now is a war film, which is to say it is almost entirely not interested in war as spectacle. It is interested in war as psychological damage. It is interested in what prolonged conflict does to the soul of the person who has been leading others through it. The film opens in the shadow of ongoing violence and does not really leave that shadow for its entire running time. The visual palette is grey cold and stripped of color in a way that feels intentional. This is a world that has been leached of warmth. The setting moves through forests, snow, and eventually a military compound built into a mountain, and at every stage the geography feels chosen not for beauty but for emotional weight. This is a film that wants you to feel the cold. At its heart, underneath the spectacle, underneath the mythology, underneath the careful placement of the story within the larger Apes universe, War for the Planet of the Apes is a personal story. It is the story of Caesar's grief. It is the story of a being who has carried the responsibility of an entire species on his back for years, who has watched that responsibility cost him everything he loves, and who finds himself standing at the most dangerous crossroads a leader can reach, the point where the desire for justice and the hunger for revenge become indistinguishable from each other. That is the story this film wants to tell, whether it tells it as fully and as deeply as it could have. That is the question we will spend this entire essay trying to answer honestly. This is a film that deserves your attention, it deserves your patience, and it deserves the kind of viewing experience that lets you sit with it, ideally in the trilogy's full context, which transforms the emotional weight of its final scenes from meaningful to devastating. Whether you have seen it before and are here to deepen your understanding, or whether you are deciding if it is worth your time, I think the answer is yes. Conditionally, honestly, with full awareness of its imperfections. Yes, coming knowing what it is rather than what the marketing suggested it was, and you will find something genuinely worth the sitting. Now let me tell you what it was like to actually sit with it. There is a particular kind of anticipation that comes with sitting down for the final chapter of something you have genuinely loved. It is different from ordinary excitement. It is closer to what you feel at the end of a long journey when you can see the destination ahead, a mixture of relief and dread, of wanting to arrive and not wanting the journey to be over. That was exactly what I brought into the cinema the first time I watched War for the Planet of the Apes. I had loved Rise unreservedly. I had considered Dawn one of the finest mainstream films of the decade it appeared in. I had followed Caesar across two films with a kind of investment that surprised even me, because intellectually I understood that this was a blockbuster franchise built around digital apes, and emotionally I could not have cared more about what happened to him if he had been made of flesh and bone and real loss. I sat down in that cinema with a full heart and high expectations and a quiet, private wish that this story would end the way it deserved to. The first thing the film does is give you text on screen. Words that establish context, that tell you the war between humans and apes has continued, that Caesar's colony is hiding in the forests, that a military faction called Alpha Omega has been hunting them with growing ferocity. It is a practical opening, the kind of scene setting that a third chapter in a complex mythology sometimes needs, but it also signals something about the film's approach. It is serious from the very first frame. It has no interest in easing you in gently. The world this film inhabits has already been damaged almost beyond repair, and it wants you to know that before the first human face or ape face appears on screen. And then the film opens with soldiers moving through a forest at night, and I want to stay with this image for a moment because it is genuinely striking. The soldiers have written things on their helmets, slogans, names, phrases, in what turns out to be a visual reference to Full Metal Jacket that the film is not shy about. The helmets carry messages like ape killer and monkey thumper, the kind of dehumanizing language that soldiers throughout history have used to make their enemies easier to destroy, and the effect on the audience is immediate and deliberate. You are being shown before a single line of dialogue has been spoken the psychology of the people hunting Caesar. You are being shown what hatred looks like when it has been institutionalized. When I first saw those helmets, I felt something shift in my chest. Not shock exactly, but recognition. That is what this film is going to be about, I thought. The language we use to justify violence. The labels we put on what we are trying to eliminate so we do not have to think of it as elimination. That recognition was important and it held me through the opening sequence. And here is what I keep returning to about that first viewing. The opening of this film is genuinely excellent. The attack on Caesar's colony, the violence of it, the way it is shot with a terrible intimacy that makes each loss specific and personal. It earns its weight. Matt Reeves directs action with a quality that is rare in franchise filmmaking. He makes you feel the physical consequences of violence rather than simply showing you its choreography. Bodies fall with the weight of real things being lost, not the weightlessness of stunt performers landing on cushioned floors. Sound design in this sequence is remarkable. The rhythm of it, the way silence punctuates the chaos rather than the other way around. When I first sat with this film, I expected the opening to be impressive in the way blockbusters are often impressive, technically accomplished, visually commanding, but emotionally distant. What I found instead was something that genuinely startled me. The violence meant something, and that meaning came from two films of accumulated love for these characters. But then something shifted, something subtle enough that I did not notice it happening in real time, but obvious enough in retrospect that I cannot explain why I missed it. As the film moved past its opening and began to settle into its actual shape, its slower, colder, more deliberately interior shape, I found myself waiting for something that never quite arrived. Not spectacle, exactly, not more action, something harder to name, a quality of aliveness perhaps, a sense that the film was discovering itself in real time, rather than executing a plan it had already completed before the cameras roared. What I found instead was a film of extraordinary craft and genuine ambition that was, despite all of that, slightly sealed, slightly closed off from the deepest emotional registers it was reaching for. The tension between what the film is trying to do and what it actually achieves is the thing I have been sitting with ever since. And to understand it fully, we need to walk through the film itself, not as a summary but as a felt experience. We need to live it together, the way it was meant to be lived. The story begins in aftermath. Caesar and his community have been in hiding for some time, not hiding in the sense of being absent from the world, but hiding in the sense of having retreated deep into the forests of what appears to be Northern California, building walls, training defenders, trying to hold the peace of their home against a military power that has decided there is no room in the world for both species. The opening engagement, the attack on the colony, sets up what will become the film's central wound within its first 20 minutes, and I will not detail it here for the benefit of those who have not seen it. But I will say this: Reeves and Bombeck understand that the most devastating losses are the ones you have come to love slowly, across years, across films. They understand the grammar of long form storytelling, the way a relationship built carefully over time can be destroyed in minutes, and the destruction will carry the full weight of everything that was built. That weight lands, even now thinking about it, it lands. What follows is a film in three loose movements, and I want to name those movements clearly because understanding the film's structure is essential to understanding both its achievements and its limitations. The first movement is the decision, Caesar's choice, in the wake of loss to pursue personal vengeance rather than lead his people to safety. The second movement is the journey, a small group of apes traveling through a cold, beautiful, and deeply dangerous landscape in search of the colonel who has taken something irreplaceable from Caesar. The third movement is the compound what happens when Caesar arrives at the place he has been hunting toward and what he finds there that no amount of prior preparation could have readied him for. The decision itself is the most psychologically interesting thing the film does, and I want to spend genuine time here because it is also the place where the film is most clearly in conversation with something larger than its own plot. Caesar has always been defined, in Rise, in Dawn, and in the early passages of war, by his refusal to become what his enemies believe him to be. The humans who fear apes, who hunt them, who cage them. Do so in part because they believe apes are ruled by instinct, by anger, by territory, by the primitive impulse to dominate. Caesar has spent 3 films disproving that belief. He has been the counter argument, he has been the living evidence that intelligence and moral restraint are not exclusively human qualities. And now, in the ruins of what the Colonel's soldiers have done to his family, to his home, to the people he loves most, Caesar feels the counter argument beginning to collapse inside him. What this film understands about that moment is something genuinely true about human experience, even though it is expressing it through a character who is not human. The understanding is this: grief and rage are not separate things. When something is taken from you violently and without justice, the grief and the rage arrive together, wound around each other so tightly that you cannot pull them apart. And the impulse to pursue the source of that violence, to find it, to face it, to make it answer for what it did, that impulse does not feel like hatred when you are inside it. It feels like love. It feels like the last thing you can do for the person you lost. Caesar sends his people ahead, sends them toward safety, toward the new home that Maurice and the others are meant to find, and he stays behind. And the other apes who refuse to leave him, who will not let him walk into darkness alone. That refusal is one of the most quietly moving things in the film, and it is something I keep coming back to. Rocket, who has been with Caesar since almost the beginning. Maurice, the orangutan whose gentleness is a form of profound strength. Luca, whose loyalty is worthless and therefore more powerful than any declaration could be. These characters do not make speeches, they simply do not lead. And in the grammar of this film, that is the loudest thing anyone says. The journey through the wilderness that follows is where the film is most purely itself, and where your relationship with its specific aesthetic will determine your experience of the entire middle section. Reeves shoots the natural world with a painter's eye, wide lenses, natural light, the kind of frames that remind you that the film is, at its most fundamental level, a series of photographs that have been given the illusion of life, snow and pine, and grey sky and the bodies of apes moving through it all with a weight and physical specificity that the performance capture technology earns completely. There are sequences in this middle passage that are genuinely beautiful in a way that transcends the genre. There is a stillness to some of this footage that feels almost devotional, as if the camera itself is paying respect to the scale of what Caesar is carrying. This is also where the film introduces the 2 characters who will shape the emotional texture of the second half in very different ways. The first is Bud a Bear, Steve Zahn's performance capture creation, a hermit ape who has survived alone in an abandoned ski resort for years, who speaks in broken, frightened, faintly comic sentences, and who joins the group with a combination of reluctance and desperate longing. Bad Ape is explicitly the film's attempt to provide tonal relief, a character whose fear and awkwardness can puncture the surrounding heaviness before it becomes suffocating. The choice to include him is a genuinely interesting one, and I want to be fair about it. Zahn's performance is surprisingly affecting underneath the comedy. There's something genuinely lonely and genuinely sad about Bad Ape, a creature who has survived by hiding, who has forgotten what it is to be part of something, and who finds in Caesar's small group a reason to stop hiding. The comedy works. The warmth works. The problem, and this is something we will return to in detail, is calibration. There are moments where Bad Ape's comic register lands in the middle of the film's grief, and instead of providing relief, it creates a kind of dissonance, a tonal interruption rather than a tonal bridge. The second new character is Nova, a young human girl, mute, found alone in a darkened house with a doll and the remnants of a life that has been taken from her. Amy Miller plays her with a quality of presence that is remarkable for someone who has almost no dialogue. Every emotion she carries is physical, expressed through her eyes and the particular way she holds her body when she is afraid versus when she is beginning to trust. Nova's relationship with Caesar, and particularly with Maurice, is one of the film's warmest subplots, and it carries its own thematic weight that becomes significant much later. There is a moment early in their relationship where Maurice, enormous, ancient, patient Maurice, offers Nova something small and gentle and she flinches, and then a moment shortly after where she does not flinch, and that progression from fear to trust is told entirely without words. think about what it means that the film places a mute human child in the care of apes and inverts every assumption the genre has historically made about who protects whom. Cinema rarely does this without announcement. This film does it quietly, almost parenthetically, and lets you find the meaning yourself. The journey leads them eventually military compound of striking visual design, a deep canyon ringed by watchtowers and walls and searchlights, and inside those walls something that stops Caesar completely when he first sees it. The apes. His apes, the colony he sent to safety, are there. They have been captured, and they are being used as forced labor to build the very fortifications that will hold them captive. I want to stay with this image because it is the most politically charged image in a film that is full of politically charged images, and in the context of 2017, it carried a weight that was impossible to separate from the world outside the cinema. Apes, compelled at gunpoint to build walls, the colonel standing over them with the absolute authority of someone who has decided that some lives exist only to serve the survival of others. This is not subtle. The film does not want it to be subtle. It wants you to feel the historical resonance of this image, not in an academic way, but in the gut, the way you feel things when cinema is working at its best. And here is where the film shifts completely, where the road movie of the second act becomes something else entirely. Caesar, who came here for revenge, who has been carrying the weight of personal hatred across miles of frozen landscape, arrives and finds that the thing he thought he was pursuing has transformed into something much larger. It is no longer just about what was taken from him. This is about what is being done to his people. This is about whether the leader can be present for something greater than his own grief, and what happens in the compound. And what the colonel reveals when Caesar finally faces him is where the film takes its most ambitious claim, and where I want to pause before we go further, because what comes next deserves its own careful attention. The colonel is not what you expect him to be. And that unexpected quality is either the film's most genuinely brave creative choice or the source of its deepest structural problem, depending on how you receive it. What Woody Harrelson brings to this role and what the writing gives him to work with is something the franchise had not previously attempted, and the attempt itself is worth examining in close detail. But before we get there, I want to turn away from the story for a moment and look at how this film was actually made. Because the craft behind War for the Planet of the Apes is extraordinary in ways that change how you see what you are watching. There is a question that serious cinema asks of its audience that lesser cinema never bothers with. It is not the question of what happens next, it is the question of how. How was this world built? How did this performance arrive at this specific quality of feeling? How did the people behind the camera make choices, technical, aesthetic, human choices that transformed a script into something you carry home with you after the credits roll? I find that when I understand how a film was made, I do not love it less. I love it more carefully. I love it with the added dimension of knowing what it cost, what it required, what problems had to be solved before the first frame could be showed. And War for the Planet of the Apes, in this regard, is one of the most fascinating production stories in recent mainstream cinema. Not because it was troubled or dramatic in the way some productions are, but because the problems it had to solve were genuinely unprecedented. The craft at work here is not just impressive, it is in several specific respects historic. Let us begin with the thing that defines this film before a single story decision is made, the performance capture technology that brings Caesar and every ape character to life. The system used across this trilogy, developed and refined primarily at Vita Digital in New Zealand, is among the most sophisticated ever deployed in service of a narrative film. But here is what I want you to understand, because it is the thing that gets lost in conversations about visual effects technology. The technology is only as meaningful as the performers inside it. The cameras mounted on the rigs above the actors' faces, capturing every micro movement of muscle and skin, recording the precise geometry of an eyebrow or the corner of a mouth. None of that means anything if the person wearing the rig is not, at the same time, genuinely feeling the thing they are performing. Performance capture does not generate emotion, it translates it, and the translation is only as rich as the original. Andy Serkis has spoken at length in interviews about what it meant to return to Caesar for this third film, and what he describes is something that sounds less like acting in the conventional sense and more like a form of long-term inhabitation. He had been living with this character for 6 years by the time war began production. He knew how Caesar moved, how he breathed, how he held stillness differently in moments of grief versus moments of decision. According to interviews conducted during the film's production period, Serkis and the director Matt Reeves spent considerable time before filming began simply discussing the internal arc, not the external plot points, but the specific emotional geography of where Caesar is at the start of this film versus where he ends. The question they were asking purportedly was not what Caesar does, but what Caesar has become, and more precisely, what the accumulated weight of leadership, loss, and war has done to the interior life of a being who once believed that reason and patience were always the strongest weapons. What Sarkis delivers in this film is a performance of almost architectural subtlety. There are scenes where Caesar says very little, where the performance is entirely physical, entirely carried by posture and eye movement, and the specific quality of his breathing, and in those scenes, Serkis is doing something that most human actors in conventional close-ups cannot manage, which is communicating the precise emotional logic of a character's interior state without the assistance of dialogue. There is a particular scene, and I will not describe its full context here because it belongs to territory we have not fully entered yet, where Caesar is alone and the camera holds on his face for an extended duration, and the journey of emotion visible in that face across those few seconds is as good as anything in the film. It is not the grief exactly, it is the grief becoming something else, something colder, something more final, and Sarkis makes you feel that transition happen without a single word. When I watch that scene, I forget entirely that what I'm looking at is a digital construction built over a human performance. I see a father. I see a leader. I see someone being slowly hollowed out by something he cannot put down. It is worth pausing here to say something that the film industry spent years resisting saying, and which the passage of time has made increasingly impossible to dispute. Andy Serkis's performance as Caesar across this trilogy, and particularly in War, is one of the finest pieces of sustained character acting in 21st century cinema. The conversation about whether performance capture constitutes acting in the formal sense, whether it deserves recognition at major award ceremonies, whether the digital construction layered over the physical performance somehow dilutes or diminishes what the performer contributes, that conversation, frankly, exposes more about the conservations of awards institutions than it does about the nature of acting itself. What Sarkis does in this film requires everything that any great screen performance requires: emotional truth, physical discipline, psychological consistency, and the courage to be completely present in moments of maximum vulnerability. The fact that his face does not appear in the final film does not reduce what he does. If anything, it makes it more remarkable because you feel him completely even through the mediation of technology, even through digital fur and digitally reconstructed eyes. You feel the human being inside the ape, and that is the whole point, but the performance capture word in War goes well beyond Sarkis. The ensemble of ape performers, Terry Notary as Rocket, Karen Konoval as Maurice, Michael Adam Thwaite as Luca, and the late Devin Dalton as Tinker, among others, represents a collective achievement that the film rests on just as heavily as its lead performance. Karan Konoval, in particular, has spoken in interviews about the years she spent researching orangutan behavior and movement, not in order to imitate it mechanically, but in order to understand what physical intelligence looks like in a being whose relationship to the world is structured differently from a human being's. Maurice moves with a quality of patient heaviness that feels completely specific and completely real, and when Maurice reaches toward Nova with that first tentative gesture of gentleness, the physical truth of it is so precise that it stops you. That is not a visual effect making you feel something. That is a performer who has done the work. The deep, unglamorous, years long work to make a digital character as physically inhabited as any fully costumed human actor on screen. Now, let me tell you something about this film's production that reshapes how you see almost every exterior scene. The decision to shoot primarily on location in the forests, mountains, and snow covered landscapes of British Columbia and Iceland, rather than relying on constructed environments or digital backlot work, was a choice with enormous practical consequences. The weather was reportedly a constant and formidable adversary. Production reportedly faced conditions in the Canadian wilderness that challenged both the human cast and crew and the technical infrastructure required to capture performance data in the field. The reeds that capture visual performance are delicate instruments, and cold weather affects both the equipment and the actors, wearing it in ways that conventional filmmaking does not have to account for. According to production reports from the period, there were days when the conditions made certain kinds of performance capture technically unreliable, and the crew had to find solutions that preserved both the emotional truth of the performance and the technical integrity of the capture data. The reason Reeves made this choice, the reason he insisted on real environments rather than constructed ones, is something he has discussed in interviews, and it connects directly to the film's thematic concerns. He wanted the apes to exist in the real world. He wanted the ground they walked on to be actual ground, the cold they were moving through to be actual cold, the scale of the landscape to be a real relationship between these characters and the physical world they inhabit. There is a philosophy filmmaking embedded in that choice, the idea that the audience can feel the difference between a performance given in a real place and a performance given in front of a green screen, even when they cannot consciously articulate why. When you watch Caesar ride through snow-covered forests on horseback, and yes, Andy Serkis performed those sequences on a real horse in real snow, wearing the performance capture rig, you are watching something that has a physical weight that purely digital construction simply does not carry. The horse is real, the ground is real, the breath misting in the cold air is real, and all of that reality transfers invisibly but unmistakably into the emotional truth of what you are watching. Here is another production detail that I find genuinely illuminating. The military compound at the center of the film's third act, the canyon fortress where the apes are held captive and forced to build fortifications, was not primarily a digitally constructed environment. The production built significant practical elements of that compound, real walls, real watchtowers, real ground, or set within an actual location. The decision to build practical sets in an era when digital construction has made physical sets almost unnecessary for this kind of production tells you something important about Reeves's priorities. He wanted the actors, human and performance capture both, to be responding to real space, real scale, real physical presence. He wanted the guards standing on real watchtowers to look down at real ground from a real height. The fear and the power dynamic of that space needed to be felt by the people inside it before it could be felt by the people watching it. And when you know that and you return to those compound sequences, you feel the difference. The walls have weight. The scale is not an approximation. The space where those apes are held is a real place, and something about that reality enters the image in ways that no amount of digital compositing entirely replicates. Michael Giacchino's score deserves its own extended consideration because music in this film is not decoration, it is argument. Giacchino, who had scored Dawn as well and who understands the emotional register of this world as intimately as anyone outside the core creative team, makes choices in words that are unlike almost anything else in contemporary blockbuster scoring. The most striking of those choices is restraint. There are extended sequences in this film where the score withdraws entirely, where the only sound is environment, footstep, breath, and the effect of that withdrawal is to place you inside the character's interior silence. When the music is absent, you are not simply watching Caesar move through a landscape. You are inside the weight he is carrying. You are in the specific quality of a grief that has gone beyond expression into something closer to climate, something ambient, total, and without edges. When the score does arrive, it tends to arrive obliquely. Giacchino has spoken about approaching the ape themes with instruments and harmonic languages that feel deliberately non Western, or rather, deliberately outside the conventional orchestral vocabulary of Hollywood heroism, because he wanted the music to communicate that Caesar's story belongs to a different emotional tradition than the one mainstream cinema typically uses for its protagonists. There are moments where the score feels almost liturgical, solemn, and slow, built on sustained tones and gradual harmonic shifts that feel less like underscore and more like mourning made audible. And then there are moments, particularly in the film's final passages, which we will not enter yet, where the music swells into something that manages to be simultaneously triumphant and heartbroken, which is one of the hardest emotional gestures for any score to achieve, and which Giacchino reaches with what sounds like genuine effort. The film was shot by cinematographer Michael Sarrazin, whose collaboration with Reeves extends back through Dawn. Sarrazin makes choices in this film that are worth lingering over because they reveal the film's visual philosophy in almost every frame. The decision to shoot in anamorphic widescreen, a format that produces a particular quality of depth and bokeh, and a specific way of rendering human and non-human faces in close-up, is not a neutral technical choice. Anamorphic lenses have a long association in cinema history with epic storytelling, with the kind of films that want their images to feel larger than the frame they are contained in. Think of Lawrence of Arabia. Think of Once Upon a Time in the West. Think of the films that understood that the relationship between a small human figure and an enormous landscape is one of cinema's fundamental subjects. Saracen and Reeves are working consciously within that tradition, using the scale of the natural world not as backdrop but as active participant in the story, as a way of communicating something about the smallness of individual lives within the sweep of species-level history. The color grading deserves mention here as well, because it is one of the most distinctive elements of the film's visual identity. War for the Planet of the Apes is, by design, one of the most desaturated blockbusters of its era. The forests are steel grey and blue-green. The compound is all shadow and yellow-white searchlight. Even the warmer scenes, the moments with Nova, the small fires the ape group builds during their journey, have a muted quality, as if the film is withholding color the way a grieving person withholds laughter. The choice communicates something specific. This is a world from which beauty has not disappeared, but from which it has receded. It is a world in recovery from something that has not finished happening yet, and the gradual, careful, almost imperceptible way that color returns in certain moments, I will let you notice those moments for yourself when you watch, is one of the film's quietest and most earned emotional instruments. I want to turn now to the writing, because the screenplay of War for the Planet of the Apes is a document that deserves serious analytical attention, both for what it achieves and for the specific places where its ambitions exceed its execution. Reeves and Bombard are working with source material, the original Apes mythology, that carries decades of cultural weight, and they are simultaneously trying to complete a very personal story arc and make a film that functions as a self-contained emotional experience for someone who might not have seen the previous two chapters. That is a genuinely difficult set of competing demands, and the script manages them with varying degrees of success. What the script gets most right is its understanding of what kind of story this is at the character level. The decision to structure the film around Caesar's internal conflict, his awareness that the path he has chosen is fundamentally at odds with everything he has always believed about the difference between apes and the violence they have always been capable of, is the right structural choice for this story. It locates the film's tension not in external plot mechanics, but in the interior life of its protagonist, which means that the film's stakes are emotional and moral rather than simply physical. Will the fortress be breached? That matters. But it matters less than the question of what Caesar do when he arrives at the fortress, whether he will still be the leader he has always tried to be, or whether the weight of what he has lost will have finally bent him into something that resembles the enemy he has always refused to become. The script is also unusually generous with silence. There are scenes, extended scenes, where no one speaks, where the film trusts entirely that the visual performance and the sound design can carry the full weight of the moment without the assistance of words. This is a rarer quality in mainstream screenwriting than it should be. Hollywood studio filmmaking has a deep institutional anxiety about silence, an assumption that if characters are not speaking, the audience is not engaged, not understanding, not being moved in the direction the film wants them to move. Reef and Baumbach reject that anxiety, and the film is better for it. Some of the most emotionally complete moments in war are moments of pure cinema. Image, movement, sound, and the space between them carrying everything, where the script is less successful, and this is something I want to be precise about rather than vague, is in its handling of the Colonel as a character. Woody Harrelson brings everything he has to this role, and there are individual moments in his performance that are quietly extraordinary. Moments where the surface aggression falls away and you see something underneath that is almost unbearable to look at. His physical performance, particularly in the film's quieter scenes, has a quality of contained violence that is genuinely unsettling in the way great screen villains are unsettling, not because they are monstrous, but because you can see the human being they might have been and understand the specific damage that turned them into what they are. Harrison is a deeply instinctive performer, and those instincts serve him well here. He underplays beautifully when the script lets him. The problem is that the script does not always let him. There is a scene, a long, pivotal scene where the colonel explains himself to Caesar, tells his story, reveals the specific loss that has shaped his specific madness, and the scene is written with a kind of expository completeness that, paradoxically, reduces its impact. Great screen villainy tends to work best when it is partially withheld, when we understand the psychology not because we have been told it, but because we have felt it accumulating through behavior, through choice, through the specific texture of how a person occupies space. The Colonel's revelation scene tells us things we need to know and tells them clearly, and yet somehow the telling makes him slightly smaller rather than larger. The mystery contracts, the horror clarifies into something more familiar, more manageable, and the film loses a dimension of menace at the precise moment it was trying to deepen it. There is also structural tension at the heart of the script that I do not think is ever fully resolved, and it is worth naming because it connects to something the film is genuinely trying to do. War is attempting to be simultaneously a personal story. Caesar's grief, Caesar's revenge arc, Caesar's internal reckoning, and a mythological one, the story of a species in the process of becoming the final chapter of a civilization's origin. Those two registers can coexist in a great film. They can even amplify each other. But it requires very precise calibration, a constant awareness of which register is carrying the weight at any given moment, and a willingness to let one yield to the other when the story demands it. There are passages in War where the mythological register overwhelms the personal one, where the film becomes so focused on what Caesar represents that it loses touch with who Caesar is. And there are passages where the personal register becomes so private, so interior that the larger stakes, the species, the future, the world being born out of this suffering, temporarily disappear from view. The film never finds the single sustained note that would hold both registers in perfect harmony throughout its running time. This matters because it affects pacing in a way that is not simply a matter of personal taste. There are sections of War, particularly in the compound's middle passages, where the film's deliberate slowness stops feeling like restraint and begins feeling like hesitation. The distinction is subtle but real. Restraint is a positive creative force. It is the withholding of something in order to make its eventual arrival more powerful. Hesitation is different. It is the absence of forward momentum without a compensating depth of interiority. It is stillness without intention. And there are perhaps 20 to 25 minutes of this film where the word I would reach for is hesitation rather than restraint, where the slowness does not seem to be in service of something accumulating beneath the surface, but rather in the absence of certainty about what should happen next. A tighter cut, something closer to 2 hours than the 2 hours and 20 minutes the film runs, would not necessarily have resolved the script's structural tensions, but it might have prevented the audience from feeling them quite so acutely. Yet here is what I keep coming back to, and it is the thing that prevents me from being entirely dismissive of what the film achieves in these middle passages. The world Matt Reeves builds in these sequences is completely realized. It has a coherent internal life. It has atmosphere, genuine atmosphere, the kind that is not manufactured by score and editing, but seems to emanate from the physical reality of the place itself. The compound, the canyon, the relationship between the imprisoned apes and the human soldiers guarding them, all of it feels like a real world with a real history, and that feeling of reality is more valuable than it might sound. Many blockbuster films of this scale feel at their worst like theme park attractions, impressively designed but fundamentally unreal, spaces you observe rather than enter. War for the Planet of the Apes feels inhabited. It feels like a place where lives have been lived and lost and are continuing to be lived and lost, even in the moments when the camera's not watching. That quality, call it wordfulness, call it cinematic conviction, is genuinely rare, and it is genuinely present here, and it earns the film a significant portion of the goodwill it needs to survive its less successful passages. The visual effects work by Veta Digital, and I want to return to this one final time before we leave the discussion of craft, because it cannot be overstated, represents a complete transformation of what digital character work can achieve in a live action film. The apes in this film do not look like special effects, they look like apes. Not like digital simulations of apes, not like cartoon approximations of what apes might look like in a Hollywood film, but like genuinely living creatures with weight and texture and the specific quality of physical presence that the camera captures differently depending on whether a thing is alive or merely constructed. The fast simulation alone, the way light moves through individual hairs, the way fur mats and clumps in wet conditions, the way it responds differently to the cold northern light of the exterior scenes versus the artificial light of the compound interiors, represents a technical problem of such complexity that it is almost impossible to articulate without a degree in physics. What Vata achieved here is not simply good visual effects work. It is a new frontier in the relationship between performance and its digital translation, a frontier that has shaped everything that has come after it. There is one specific technical achievement in this film that I think deserves to be named because it reveals something about the ambition of the collaboration between Reeves and his visual effects team. Throughout the film, and with particular intensity in its final act, the apes are placed in direct optical interplay with human actors in real environments, sharing actual physical space, responding to actual light, existing in the same frame with a visual consistency that demands that both elements be equally real. Practical and computational choice of ensuring that a digitally created character shares the same space with a live action performer in a way that the eye never catches is one of the central technical achievements of the modern era of performance capture filmmaking. And War pushes it further than Dawn did, and Dawn pushed it further than Rise, and the cumulative effect of that technological development across three films is a kind of miracle that we have grown so accustomed to that we have stopped noticing it. We forget that what we are watching is impossible. We forget that none of these characters, in the literal physical sense, exist. We forget completely that Andy Serkis's face is not in this film, and the forgetting is the achievement. The total, effortless, irreversible forgetting is the whole point. Let me gather together what we have been saying about the craft of this film, because I want you to carry it forward as we move into the more difficult territory of what the film does not do, as well as what it does. War for the Planet of the Apes is made by people who understand cinema as an art form, not just a delivery system for story and spectacle, but a medium with its own specific language, its own way of generating meaning through the relationship between image and sound and time. Reeves is a filmmaker of genuine vision, and that vision is consistently visible in this film. The performance work, Serkis, Edison Konoval, Zahn, Millar, is uniformly excellent in different registers and different scales. The score is one of the finest pieces of blockbuster music in a decade of blockbuster music. The cinematography is purposeful and beautiful. The visual effects represent state of the art at the moment this film was made and arguably beyond it. All of this is real. All of this is well. And yet, the film does not fully arrive at the emotional destination it is navigating toward. Not because the craft fails, but because, and this is the distinction I want to hold carefully as we move into our assessment of the film's limitations. Craft is not the same as emotional truth, and technical excellence is not the same as narrative completion. You can build a perfect vessel and still not quite fill it with the thing it was built to carry. War for the Planet of the Apes is close to being that perfect vessel. But close in cinema, as in everything else, is a different country from Arrival. And it is that distance, that honest, specifically, precisely measurable distance between what this film reaches for and what it achieves, that we need to examine next. There is a particular kind of honesty that film criticism owes to the films it loves most or wants most to love. It is not the honesty of indifference, not the detached assessment of something you never cared about. It is the harder, more intimate honesty of someone who sat with the film in good faith, who brought real feeling to it, who wanted it to succeed at everything it was attempting, and who must now, with the same care and precision they brought to celebrating its achievements, account for the ways it did not. This honesty is not cruelty, it is the final form of respect. You only hold something to a high standard if you believe it was built for one, and War for the Planet of the Apes was absolutely built for a high standard, which is precisely why its failures deserve the same quality of attention as its successes. Let us begin with the flaw that sits closest to the center of the film's emotional machinery, because it is the one that most determines how fully the film works as a complete experience. The pacing of War for the Planet of the Apes is not simply slow. Slowness, as I said in our previous movement, is a legitimate artistic choice, and this film has sequences where its slowness is genuinely purposeful and genuinely effective. The problem is something more specific than pace. It is a recurring disconnection between the film's emotional intentions and the actual felt experience of watching it unfold. There are passages, particularly in the compound's middle section, where the film has clearly decided that the audience should be feeling something deep and accumulating, a sense of dread building toward inevitability, perhaps, or a growing awareness of the full scale of what has been lost and what is at stake, but where the mechanics of the scene, the writing, the editing choices are not successfully generating that feeling. The film tells you that you should be devastated, but it does not always do the work of making devastation happen inside you, and the gap between being told to feel something and actually feeling it is, in cinema, a chasm. This matters most in the compound sequences because those sequences carry the heaviest emotional weight of the film's final act, and because the film's resolution, emotional and narrative both, depends entirely on your having been fully inhabited by what happens there. If the dread has genuinely accumulated, if the suffering of the imprisoned apes has been fully transmitted to you across the screen, then what follows earns everything it is reaching for. But if those middle sequences have left you at a slight remove, engaged intellectually, with the ideas being presented but not fully inside the experience, then the ending, however skillfully executed, lands at a different depth than it was designed to. This is, in my experience, what War for the Planet of the Apes does to a significant portion of its audience, including me, on first viewing. It keeps you at a half step of emotional distance from its most important moments, and I believe I can identify specifically why. The film's compound sequences are built around the premise of sustained suffering. The apes enduring forced labor, deprivation, punishment, and sustained suffering is one of the most technically difficult emotional registers for a film to maintain without losing its audience. The reason is a paradox at the heart of cinema spectatorship. If suffering is shown continuously, without variation, without moments of contrast or relief, or the specific illumination that comes when suffering produces insight in the character experiencing it, the audience begins to adapt to it. Not because they are heartless, but because the human perceptual system is designed to habituate to sustained stimuli. The suffering becomes ambient, it becomes the condition rather than the event. And conditions, unlike events, do not generate emotion, they generate endurance. And endurance, while it is a legitimate response to a certain kind of film, certain wartime films, certain films about historical atrocity, is not the same as the active emotional engagement that War for the Planet of the Apes is trying to produce. It wants grief and outrage and a building sense of moral urgency. What it generates in these passages is more muted, a somber, patient, slightly distanced witnessing. The introduction of Bad Ape, which I touched on in our earlier movement, is in theory the solution to exactly this problem, a source of tonal variation that can interrupt the heaviness before it becomes total, can introduce warmth and even gentle humor into an atmosphere that would otherwise be unrelieved. And as I said before, Steve Zahn's performance works. The warmth is genuine. The loneliness beneath the comedy is touching in the way it is intended to be touching. But here is the specific calibration problem. The moments of tonal relief that Bad Ape provides sometimes arrive in the wrong places. Not always. Sometimes they are perfectly timed, a moment of levity that punctures the tension at precisely the point where the tension needs puncturing and returns you to the heavier, mature emotional openness. But there are other moments, and if you have seen the film, you will recognize what I am describing, where Bad Ape's comedy arrives not as a bridge between emotional registers, but as a disruption of one that was working, where you are fully inside something difficult and genuine, and the tonal shift pull you out of it rather than preparing you for a deeper entry. The result is a film that occasionally feels like it is working against itself, sabotaging its own most effective sequences with relief that hasn't been earned by the preceding weight. This is a structural problem rather than a performance one, and I want to be precise about that distinction because it matters for how we understand what went wrong. Zahn is not at fault. The writing that created Bad Ape is not wrong in its instinct. The instinct to create tonal variation is correct, and a version of this film without any of Bad Ape's warmth would be genuinely less alive. The fault is in the sequencing, in the specific moments chosen for relief versus the specific moments chosen for sustained engagement, and that is an editing and directorial decision rather than a writing or performance one. It suggests that in the final cut, certain choices were made about rhythm that sacrificed the film's deepest emotional coherence in favor of a more conventional blockbuster pacing structure. The pressure of the studio release format, the need to prevent any 10-minute stretch from feeling too unrelieved for a mainstream audience may be partly responsible. I can only speculate about the conversations in the editing room, but the effect is visible on screen, and it is one of the film's most honest limitations. The character of Nova presents a different kind of problem, and one that I find more philosophically interesting, even if it is less immediately damaging to the film's moment to moment experience. Nova, as I described earlier, is beautifully performed and thematically rich. The question her presence raises about the nature of humanity, about what it means to be cared for by someone your species has defined as less than you, is genuinely worth asking, and the film asks it with genuine sensitivity. But Nova also carries a narrative burden that the film is not entirely transparent about, and when that burden is revealed, it creates a retroactive question about the film's handling of her character that I find slightly uncomfortable. Nova's muteness is revealed as the film progresses to be not simply an individual trait but a symptom of something much larger, a condition that is spreading, that is specifically affecting a certain portion of the human population, and that carries enormous implications for the balance of power between apes and humans in the world the film is building. This is a bold narrative choice, and it connects the film directly to the mythology of the original 1968 film in a way that is structurally elegant and thematically meaningful. But here is what troubles me about it. Nova, for much of the film's running time, is primarily a vehicle for warmth, a way of showing Caesar's and Maurice's capacity for protective love toward a creature who cannot advocate for herself. She is, in other words, functioning as a symbol of innocence and vulnerability. And when she is revealed to also be a plot mechanism, a key that unlocks the door to a larger piece of mythological architecture, the film has to perform a kind of tonal reconciliation between Nova as person and Nova as symbol that it does not fully achieve. She never quite becomes as specific and as irreducibly individual as the film needs her to be for the emotional weight of her relationship with Maurice and Caesar to function at maximum depth. This is a symptom of something broader in the screenplay, a tendency when faced with a choice between developing a character and serving the plot to choose the plot. It is a tendency that War shares with many franchise films, and naming it does not make it unique to this film. But it matters more here than it might in a lesser film, because the entire emotional project of the trilogy has been the radical humanization of non-human characters. The insistence that interiority, love, grief, moral reasoning, and the full complexity of personhood are not exclusively human properties. That insistence requires that every character the film asks us to care about be given a fully realized inner life, not just the characters at the center. When Nova or Yuka or certain of the imprisoned apes are treated as primarily symbolic rather than primarily specific, the film undermines its own most important claim. It says one thing about personhood and then, in the margins of its own storytelling, does another. There is one further area of genuine creative limitation that I want to address, and it is the one that is perhaps most debated among people who love this film and people who feel something is missing from it. The ending, which we will examine in full detail in our spoiler section, is designed to be devastating. Everything the film has built is aimed at producing a specific emotional experience in its final minutes, and it does produce something. But here's the honest truth of my experience with that ending, and I suspect it is an experience shared by more people than tend to say it aloud. The devastation, when it arrives, feels slightly more intellectual than visceral. You understand why it is devastating. You follow the logic of the emotion completely, but you do not entirely feel it at the depth you have been prepared to feel it at, because the film's preceding passage through the compound has not accumulated the emotional pressure that the ending needs to release. Great final scenes work the way great musical codas work. They release something that has been building under enormous pressure throughout the entire piece, and the release is overwhelming precisely because of the accumulated weight it is carrying. War's ending releases something real, but the pressure behind it is not quite as immense as it needed to be. Not because the ending is wrong, because the path to it needed, in certain specific places, to go deeper. I want to be clear about something before we move forward, because I am aware that what I have been saying in this movement could create the impression that War for the Planet of the Apes is a film that does not work, a failed attempt at something ambitious. That is not my view, and it is not the honest assessment. What I have been describing are the specific places where a very good film falls short of being a great one. The distance between very good and great is not the same as the distance between bad and good. It is a smaller distance and in many ways a more painful one, because you can see exactly what greatness would have looked like from where you are standing. War for the Planet of the Apes is a film I respect enormously and love in parts and find genuinely moving in its best moments. Its flaws are real, but there's the flaws of genuine ambition, of a film reaching for something larger than most blockbusters bother to reach for. There is a category of cinematic failure that is more interesting, more valuable, and more worth watching than the category of cinematic success that never aimed at anything that could have failed. War belongs to the former category, and that is not a consolation prize. That is a real and meaningful distinction. Now let us turn from what the film fails at towards something that it succeeds at so completely that I think it deserves to anchor our understanding of what this film is ultimately about. because underneath the structure, underneath the craft, underneath the specific choices of pacing and character and tonal register, underneath all of it, there is something this film genuinely understands about human experience, something it is trying to say with complete sincerity and considerable wisdom, and the saying of it elevates the film beyond its limitations. Over for the Planet of the Apes is, at its most essential level, a film about what hatred costs the person who is holding it, not what it costs them externally, in relationships, lost in communities, fractured in the practical consequences of decisions made from rage rather than reason. Those external costs are present in the film and they are real. But the cost the film is most interested in is interior. It is the cost to the self. It is what happens to the architecture of a person, an ape in this case, but the distinction is the whole point. When they allow the desire for revenge to occupy a space inside them that was previously held by something else. By hope, perhaps, by the belief that patience and moral clarity are more powerful than force, by the vision of a future that is different from the present. When Caesar chooses to pursue vengeance rather than lead his people, he is not simply making a strategic mistake. He is voluntarily surrendering the thing that has made him Caesar, the quality of his moral imagination, the capacity to see beyond his own pain to the larger pattern of which that pain is a part. And what this film understands with genuine wisdom is that this kind of surrender does not announce itself. It does not arrive with clarity and warning. It arrives disguised as love. It arrives disguised as duty. It arrives disguised as the most natural thing in the world to a person who has been hurt at the very center of their being, the need to make the hurting stop by finding the source of it and facing it and making it answer. Think about what that means for the experience of watching this film. Think about the specific moral weight it places on the audience. Because we want Caesar to pursue revenge, we want it instinctively, viscerally, from the very moment the loss occurs. The film has given us enough history with Caesar, enough investment in what was taken from him, that our first emotional response to his decision is not judgment, but solidarity. We are with him. We feel the rightness of what he is choosing, and that feeling, that immediate instinctive identification with the desire for revenge, is not an accident of storytelling. It is the film's central moral experiment. It is putting you inside the psychology of someone making a choice that will cost them everything, and making you feel from the inside why that choice is irresistible. Because it is. Because in the moment it presents itself, it does not feel like hatred. It feels like love wearing its final form. The symbols and motifs through which the film carries this understanding are carefully and consistently deployed. The physical journey itself, the trek through wilderness and goal toward the compound, is structured as a descent, not in a melodramatic sense, not with sudden dramatic reversals, but in the slow, relentless, almost geological way that genuine moral descent happens in real human life. Each mile traveled brings Caesar further from the thing he sent his people toward: safety, a new beginning, the future he has always been building for, and closer to the thing he cannot release. The landscape reflects this progression with a precision that feels deliberate. The world gets colder, the light gets thinner, the frames grow more compressed and more weighted as the journey continues. Harrelson's camera, which in the earlier parts of the film gave the wilderness an austere beauty, a quality of difficult sublimity, gradually closes down that beauty as Caesar moves deeper into his obsession. By the time he arrives at the compound, the world has lost almost all of its openness. The frames feel like cells, like the thing Caesar has been pursuing has become the thing that contains him. The figure of the colonel carries his own symbolic weight, and it is here that the film makes perhaps its most sophisticated thematic move, the one that elevates it, despite everything, above the level of the simple revenge narrative it superficially resembles. The colonel, when Caesar finally faces him, turns out to be a mirror, not in the obvious, on the no sense of being, simply the dark reflection of everything Caesar fears becoming. but in the more precise and more disturbing sense of being a person who also made a choice that he believed at the moment of making it was the only choice available to someone in his position. He also acted from love. He also acted from the belief that what he was doing was necessary for the survival of something larger than himself. He also surrendered something essential in the making of that choice and is continuing to pay for that surrender in ways that have left him hollowed out in the precise way Caesar is beginning to hollow out. The film does not equate them. It does not ask you to forgive the colonel or excuse what he has done, but it asks you to understand the specific human or ape or simply sentient mechanism by which a person becomes capable of the thing the colonel has become capable of. And in doing so, it makes its moral argument not as a statement but as a question. What separates Caesar from the colonel? And is that separation as stable as Caesar has always believed it to be? There is a recurring visual motif that the film uses to carry this question without ever putting it into spoken words, and I want to describe it carefully because it is one of the most formally intelligent things in the film. Throughout the movie, in brief, almost subliminal passages, we catch reflections of Caesar in surfaces: water, glass, metal. The reflection is always slightly distorted, recognizable as Caesar, but altered, different, carrying a quality of strangeness that the direct image does not have. It is a classic cinematic motif. The fractured reflection as a metaphor for the fractured self, and in less careful hands it might feel heavy handed. But Reeves uses it sparingly, and the distortion is subtle enough that you do not always consciously register what you are seeing. You feel it rather than observe it. And the accumulation of those briefly glimpsed distortions, the growing frequency with which Caesar's image appears to him in ordered form, functions as a visual diary of his interior disintegration, one that bypasses your analytical mind entirely and goes straight into your body. The religious imagery woven through the film is equally deliberate and equally worth examining. Caesar, at various points in the film's final act, occupies visual compositions that echo Christian iconography with a specificity that cannot be accidental. The position of his body, the presence of others in specific spatial relationships around him, the quality of light in certain key frames. Sheaves and Stilson are drawing a conscious parallel between Caesar's story and the narrative arc of a sacrificial figure, someone who absorbs the suffering of a community, who endures what cannot be endured so that others can be carried through to something better. This parallel is not a declaration of religious belief. It is the use of an iconographic language that carries in Western cultural consciousness one of the most powerful emotional charges available, the image of suffering that is simultaneously depersonal and universally redemptive. Whether or not you respond to the specific theological dimensions of that iconography, you respond to the visual drama of it, because it is built into the cinematic tradition you have been trained on your entire life as a viewer. What is particularly interesting about the way the film deploys this imagery is that it places Caesar, an ape, a being that the dominant cultural tradition from which that iconography derives has explicitly excluded from the category of the spiritually significant, inside the visual language of that tradition with complete seriousness. It is a quiet form of radicalism, done without announcement and without agenda, simply by placing a digitally created chimpanzee in a visual composition that carries the weight of 2000 years of meaning. Think about what that means for the film's larger argument about personhood, about who deserves to be the subject of stories told with this kind of moral and spiritual seriousness. Think about the fact that by the end of this film, you are not questioning Caesar's right to occupy that iconographic space. You have forgotten completely that there was ever a question. The theme of language, or more precisely, of the relationship between language and power, between the capacity to speak and the right to be heard, runs through the entire trilogy, and war brings it to its most complex expression. The Apes have been learning to speak across three films. Their language grows from single words to sentences to arguments to philosophy. The humans, meanwhile, certain humans, are losing language. Nova cannot speak. Others cannot speak. The film is staging over its full running time a slow and terrible inversion of the hierarchy that has always defined the relationship between human and non-human in this world. Those who could speak are losing words. Those who had no words are gaining them. And the question the film is circling, never asking it directly, but always circling, is whether language was ever really the thing that determined who deserved power, or whether it was simply the excuse. Whether hierarchy was always about something else, fear perhaps, and the desire to keep fear manageable by keeping its object contained, and language was simply the most convenient available justification. This is the film's deepest and most resonant idea, and it is an idea with real world weight that extends well beyond the Apes mythology. Every system of oppression in human history has required a rationale, a reason why the people being oppressed deserve their oppression, or at least cannot resist it. Those rationales have taken many forms across history, but they share a common structural quality. They locate the justification for oppression in a supposed deficiency of the oppressed. They are less intelligent, they are less civilized, they are less fully human, less fully persons, less fully deserving of the protections and dignities that the dominant group extends to its own members. War for the Planet of the Apes holds a mirror to this logic with clarity and without flinching, and it does so in a way that is specific enough to be genuinely challenging rather than so abstract as to be comfortable. The apes building the colonel's walls are a real image. The apes in chains are a real image. The human figure standing over them with absolute authority and absolute indifference to their suffering is a real image. These images existed in the world the film was made in. They exist in the world the film is due being watched in, and the film does not pretend otherwise. Now, all of this brings us to where this film sits within the remarkable trilogy it concludes, and within the longer arc of the Apes franchise as a whole, because that positioning tells us something important about what war accomplishes and what it does not, and about whether it was the right ending for the story it was concluding. Rise of the Planet of the Apes established a character, Caesar, whose interiority and moral complexity were so richly realized that they fundamentally changed the expectations for what a franchise film could do with a non-human protagonist. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes took that character and placed him in the most difficult situation available to a leader of his kind, a moment of potential peace, fragile and hard won and surrounded by the forces that want to destroy it, where the question of whether trust can survive fear is the central dramatic engine. Dawn is, in my assessment, the finest film of the trilogy. Perhaps one of the finest mainstream genre films of its decade, because it achieves an almost perfect balance between its intimate human and ape drama and its larger mythological ambitions. The peace it depicts feels genuinely possible, the forces that destroy it feel genuinely inevitable, and the grief of watching those two truths coexist is the film's primary gift. War arrives carrying everything Dawn established and everything Rice built before it, and its explicit ambition is to complete Caesar's story in a way that is worthy of the entire arc. In certain respects, it succeeds. The visual and technological ambition of War exceeds even Dawn. The emotional commitment of its performances is consistent with the standards the trilogy established, and the mythological architecture it puts in place, the connection to the original 1968 film, the suggestion of a world continuing to transform interactions, both terrible and hopeful, is handled with genuine elegance. What War adds to the franchise's larger conversation that neither of its predecessors quite managed is a sustained and unflinching exploration of leadership's psychological cost, of what happens to the person who must always be the one deciding, always be the one responsible, always be the one who must contain their own grief, so that others can trust in the direction they are being led. This is not a subject that action cinema typically has patience for, and the fact that War has that patience, even imperfectly, even incompletely, is one of its genuine contributions. What War does not add, and what the trilogy as a whole is slightly diminished by its failure to add, is a female ape character of comparable depth, agency, and interior richness to Caesar. The trilogy's gender politics are its most consistent blind spot. Across three films, the female apes are supporting presences, loving, loyal, and largely reactive to events driven by male characters. This is a limitation that reflects broader patterns in franchise filmmaking and does not make the films unwatchable. But it is worth naming because the trilogy's central argument that these characters deserve to be seen as fully complex persons is somewhat undercut by its own failure to apply that argument equally across gender. A trilogy so genuinely interested in the full humanity of its non human characters should have been equally interested in the full personhood of its non male characters. That it was not is an honest flaw, and one that a future return to this franchise, in whatever form it takes, would do well to address. Does war deepen what Dawn and Rise established? Yes, in specific and meaningful ways. Does it conclude the trilogy with the full emotional power that the preceding films earned? Almost. Not quite. It arrives at significance, without quite arriving at the devastating completeness that a perfect trilogy conclusion achieves, the quality of the third act of a great novel, where everything that came before is not just continued but transformed, where you could not have understood the full meaning of what you read in the first two volumes until you arrived at the final pages of the third. War gives you a conclusion that is emotionally true and thematically coherent. It does not give you the transformation, the retrospective illumination of everything that preceded it that would have made it the film the first two chapters deserved. It closes the story. It does not open it up into something larger than itself. And yet, and here is the thing I keep returning to, the thing that has kept me thinking about this film years after its release, the attempt itself matters. The trilogy as a whole, from the first frame of Rise to the final frame of War, represents something genuinely rare in the history of mainstream franchise filmmaking: a coherent creative vision sustained across 3 films and 6 years in service of a set of ideas that have real moral weight and real human relevance. The individual imperfections of war do not undo that achievement. They are the natural consequence of attempting something on this scale with this kind of sincerity. The best art fails at the edges of its ambition. And War for the Planet of the Apes has, among its many qualities, genuine ambition, the kind that reaches past what is safe and comfortable and achievable with certainty towards something larger and more important and correspondingly harder to fully grasp. That reaching is worth something. In a cinema landscape increasingly defined by the careful management of risk, by the franchise logic that prioritizes the reproduction of what has worked before over the attempt at something new, a film that reaches for genuine meaning, imperfectly, incompletely, but with real conviction, is not something to dismiss. It is something to sit with, something to return to, something perhaps to keep coming back to precisely because it leaves you with questions rather than answers, with the experience of reaching rather than the satisfaction of our own. That is what this film left behind in me. And that is what we are going to talk about next, in the full open spoiler rich territory where the film's ending can finally be seen clearly and held up to the light and understood for everything it was trying to be. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here, go experience it first, and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. For those of you who are still here, welcome to the part of the essay where the gloves come off, where we can finally talk about everything, where the film's ending, its hidden architecture, its most carefully concealed emotional logic, can be laid open and examined with the full attention it deserves. Because War for the Planet of the Apes, in its final act, attempts something that very few franchise films have the courage to attempt, and the attempt, even where it is imperfect, even where the execution does not fully match the ambition, reveals the heart of what this film has always been about beneath its surface of action and mythology and spectacular visual craft. The ending of this film is not a victory. It is something more complicated, more honest, and more difficult to hold than a victory. It is a conclusion that asks you to carry two contradictory feelings simultaneously: grief and hope, loss and arrival, the devastation of what has been surrendered, and the wonder of what that surrender has made possible. Whether you are pushing fully is a question I want us to answer together carefully across the entire territory this movement will cover. But before we reach the ending, we need to walk every step of the path that leads there. Because the ending only means what it means if you have been inside every moment that preceded it. Let us begin where the film spoiler territory opens, with the murder of Cornelia and Blue Eyes. The attack on Caesar's colony in the film's opening sequence is, as I described earlier, a moment of genuine power. But the specific nature of what is taken from Caesar in that attack is what transforms the film from a war narrative into a grief narrative, and that transformation is everything. Cornelia, Caesar's mate, the female ape whose presence across the trilogy has been quiet but persistent, a grounding force in Caesar's life, the mother of his children, is killed in the Colonel's raid. Blue Eyes, Caesar's eldest son, who appeared in Dawn as a young ape navigating the difficult passage between his father's world and a more aggressive, less patient set of values, and who resolved that navigation beautifully into something approaching wisdom, is killed in the same raid. These are not anonymous losses. The trilogy has given us enough time with both characters, enough specific detail about their relationships with Caesar that their deaths land with genuine weight. Blue Eyes in particular, who spent the entirety of Dawn in conflict with his father and arrived at the end of it with a hard-won understanding of everything Caesar has been trying to build, represents a specific kind of loss that goes beyond the personal. He was the future. He was the proof that what Caesar had built could be passed forward intact. His death is not just the death of a son, it is the death of a certain kind of faith in continuity. What is important to understand about how these states function within the film's emotional architecture is that they are staged with deliberate restraint. Reeves does not linger. He does not give you the extended death scenes, the drawn-out farewells, the theatrical grief that most franchise filmmaking would reach for in this moment because it is the easiest and most reliable way to generate audience emotion. Instead, the deaths arrive quickly, almost too quickly, in a way that initially feels disorienting, and the camera moves to Caesar's face in their aftermath rather than dwelling on what has been lost. This is a specific artistic choice, and it is the right one, for a reason that the film understands very clearly. The deaths themselves are not the emotional event. Caesar's face after them is the emotional event. The experience of watching a being of this particular quality of interior life, this specific combination of intelligence and love and long cultivated restraint, absorb a loss of this magnitude is more devastating than any amount of dramatized depth. What you are watching on Serkis's face in those moments is not performance, it is transmission. It is the direct communication of something that happens in real human beings when the worst possible thing arrives, and that something is not grief yet. It is the terrible suspended instant before grief, the moment of complete and total comprehension, before the comprehension becomes feeling, when the reality of what has happened is simply, nakedly, unbearably true. I want to stay with this for a moment because it connects to something important about the film's understanding of what makes loss devastating at its deepest level. The film is not simply telling us that Caesar has lost people he loves, though he has, it is telling us something about the specific quality of what these particular losses take from him. Blue Eyes was the continuation of a vision. Cornelia was the anchor of a home. Together, they represented the things that make a life survivable even at its most difficult. The sense that it is going somewhere, and the sense that wherever it goes, there is something waiting for you that is yours. When both are taken simultaneously, what is left is not simply grief. What is left is a particular form of purposelessness, a state where the future has been evacuated of meaning and the present has been stripped of warmth simultaneously. Caesar, in the hours and days following this loss, is not simply a bereaved father and husband, he is a being for whom the primary organizing principles of his existence have been removed. And into that void, into the space where the future and the warmth used to be, something else moves, something cold and patient and very, very certain of itself. The desire to find the kernel, the desire to make it stop, the desire to do with his hands the thing he has always believed his hands should not do, The decision scene, where Caesar tells Maurice and the others that he will not be going with them, that he must stay, that they must take his younger son Cornelius and the others and go north and find the home they have been seeking, is written and performed with a quality of agonizing calm that I find more affecting than almost anything else in the film. Caesar is not dramatic about this decision. He does not make a speech. He does not ask for permission or offer justifications at length. He simply tells them what he is going to do, and the telling is the most complete expression of how far he has already traveled from the person he was. The sister of Rice, who articulated his refusal to become an instrument of violence with those famous three letters scratched on a wall, would not have made this decision. The Caesar of Dawn, who held himself back from the brink, who refused to let Koba's betrayal become the final word on what apes are capable of, would have made a different choice. The Caesar of War makes this choice because something inside him has already decided, and what the scene is doing is showing you the decision after it has been made, rather than in the process of being made. The decision was made at the moment Blue Eyes fell. Everything since has been its execution. What Rocket and Maurice do in response to this, choosing to stay, refusing to leave Caesar to pursue his obsession alone, is, as I said before, one of the film's most quietly moving things. But I want to go deeper into it now in this spoiler rich territory because the specific meaning of their choice shifts when you know the whole film. They do not stay because they think Caesar is right. They are not endorsing the choice. They are not following a leader they believe to be making a good decision. They are doing something older and more fundamental than loyalty to a leader's judgment. They are doing what you do when you love someone who is walking into something that will damage or destroy them. You go with them. Not because you can't stop it. Sometimes you know you cannot stop it, but because the alternative, letting someone you love face the worst thing alone, is simply not something you are capable of choosing, regardless of the practical logic of the situation. There is no strategy in Rocket's refusal to leave Caesar. There is only love. And love, this film understands, does not always look like wisdom. Sometimes it looks exactly like this: two old friends mounting their horses in the cold, in the dark, to follow someone towards something they know will not end well, because the following is the only form of care they have left to offer. The figure of Luca deserves particular attention here, because his death, which arrives early in the compound sequence, before the full horror of the place has been established, in an act of protection that is both physically specific and thematically loaded, is one of the film's most underappreciated emotional moments. Luca is the ape who never speaks. Across both Dawn and War, he communicates entirely through physical presence, through the specific quality of how he holds himself near Caesar, through the watchfulness of his attention, through the readiness that never leaves his body. He is, in the most literal sense, a guardian. His entire characterization is the characterization of unconditional protective loyalty, expressed without words, expressed purely through being there. When he dies protecting Novel, a human child, the child of the species that has been hunting and killing apes throughout the entire film. From the colonel's soldiers, the gesture carries a weight that extends far beyond the personal. It is an ape dying to protect a human. In a film about an ape-human war, in a world where every institutional force is insisting that this kind of protection is impossible, unnatural, and dangerous, Luca's death is a small act of enormous moral consequence. It says, without words, the most important thing the film has to say, that the categories we use to determine who deserves protection are not natural laws, they are choices, and they can always be made differently. Now let us turn to the compound itself, to what Caesar finds when he arrives, and to the full revelation of what the colonel has been building and why. The image of Caesar seeing his colony, seeing the apes he sent to safety, the apes he believed were traveling north toward a new beginning, in chains at forced labor, building the very walls that will keep them captive, is one I have already described in our earlier movement. But I want to return to it now with the full context of the spoiler territory available to us, because the specific emotional logic of this moment is more complex than it initially appears. Caesar arrives at the compound having already made a choice that has cost him the very role he is supposed to be fulfilling. The role of leader, of the one who goes ahead to scout the safe path, of the one whose judgment the whole community follows because it is the judgment most consistently oriented toward the community's survival rather than the individual's needs. He has abandoned that role, he has left it behind on a mountain in the snow with the bodies of the family he could not save. He came here for personal reasons. And what he finds is not a personal situation at all. This is the reversal that the film has been building towards since its opening. The moment when Caesar's private grief is forced into confrontation with his public responsibility. He cannot pretend, standing in that canyon and looking down at his enslaved people, that this is still simply about what was taken from him. The scale of what is happening here, the systematic suffering of an entire community, makes his personal story suddenly very small, not invalid, not unreal, but small relative to this. And the film is brilliant in how it handles Caesar's response to this reversal because his response is not immediate moral clarity. It is not the moment where the grief gives way to the leader and Caesar becomes himself again. Instead, the fear keeps him in a suspended state, still pursuing his original purpose, still intent on finding the colonel and facing him. But now, carrying the additional weight of knowing that whatever he does here, it must account for something larger than himself. The grief and the responsibility are now occupying the same body simultaneously, and the tension between them is what drives the film's final act. Caesar's capture, his decision in a night raid gone wrong to allow himself to be taken rather than flee, is one of the film's most morally complex moments, and I want to spend genuine time on it because it is easy to read as a simple plot contrivance and much harder and much more rewarding to read as a deliberate character choice that reveals something essential about where Caesar is in his interior art. On the surface, it seems like a tactical failure. Caesar is caught because he does not prioritize his own escape. But watch the sequence carefully, and what you see is a being who, at the moment of decision, does not choose to run, does not choose to save himself, makes in the chaos of that moment the opposite choice, the choice to stay, to be present, to face what is in this place rather than flee from it. Whether this is a conscious decision or something more intuitive and instinctive is deliberately left ambiguous. But the effect is that Caesar enters the compound not as a rescuer or a liberator, but as a prisoner, as one of the suffering community rather than the leader looking down on it from outside. And that positional shift from the one who watches to the one who endures is essential to everything that happens in the film's final third. Inside the compound, as a prisoner, Caesar endures. He endures the physical hardship, the deprivation, the deliberate degradations that the colonel's soldiers inflict on the apes under their control. He endures watching his people suffer in ways he cannot prevent. He endures the specific cruelty of a guard. A human soldier given the brief nickname Preacher, played with an uncomfortable ordinariness by Gabriel Chavaria, who seems less motivated by ideology than by the particular pleasure some people take in wielding small powers over those who cannot resist them. These sequences are among the most difficult to watch in the film, and they are intended to be. The deliberate, low-grade, systematic nature of the humiliation the apes are subjected to is the film's most pointed political statement, because this is not spectacular violence, not the kind of violence that announces itself and demands a response. It is the kind that gets normalized. The kind that continues not because it must, but because no one in the power structure has decided it should stop. The ordinary cruelty that sustains systems of oppression is always harder to dramatize than the spectacular kind, and always more important to show, because it is the ordinary kind that does most of the damage in the real world. Reeves films these sequences with a controlled, deliberately undramatic camera that refuses to aestheticize what it is showing, refuses to make the suffering beautiful or the cruelty stylized, insisting instead on the plain unmediated fact of it. And then Caesar is brought to the corner, and this is where everything the film has been building, every layer of character and theme and symbol, arrives at its single most important theme. The meeting between Caesar and the colonel is staged as a conversation between two beings who have, from the outside, the clearest possible relationship to each other, captor and prisoner, oppressor and oppressed, the one with absolute power and the one with none. But the film immediately and deliberately complicates that apparent clarity, because what the Colonel reveals in this conversation is not the face of simple evil, is not the ideology of a true believer, not the cold calculation of a strategist, not even the straightforward brutality of a soldier who has dehumanized his enemy so thoroughly that he can no longer see them as anything other than a threat to be eliminated. What the Colonel reveals is something far more disturbing and far more recognizably human. He reveals a wound. The Colonel's explanation of why he is doing what he is doing, the logic behind the enslavement, behind the fortification project, behind the systematic brutality, is on its own terms internally coherent. He has seen something spreading through the human population, a mutation, a regression, a loss of the very capacities that the Colonel believes define humanity and justify its claim to dominance. People are losing language. People are losing the cognitive complexity that makes civilization possible. And the Colonel has decided, with the terrible certainty of a man who believes he is the last rational person in an irrational world, that this loss is something he must stop at any cost. He is not building walls to keep apes out. He is building walls to keep something else from getting in. The contagion of the regression, the spreading silence, the world going dark around him. He is in his own self-understanding, the last guardian of something irreplaceable. He is the person who understands what is at stake when everyone else is too frightened or too compromised to face it. What makes this revelation simultaneously the film's gravest creative choice and its most structurally problematic moment is the way it recontextualizes the Colonel's horror without excusing it. We understand after this conversation why the Colonel has become what he has become. We understand the specific logic, the grief hidden beneath the ideology, the fear hidden beneath the certainty, the desperation hidden beneath the authority. Woody Harrelson delivers this revelation with a performance of sustained, precise restraint that is one of the finest pieces of screen acting in the film. The anger is always present, but it is always contained, always channeled through the specific grammar of a military man for whom the expression of feeling is a form of weakness he has trained himself not to permit. When the Colonel's control momentarily slips in the passage where he describes the choice he made about his own son, who began to show the symptoms of the mutation, the effect is physically uncomfortable. You see the human being inside the authority, and the human being is in agony, has been in agony for a long time, and has translated that agony through a process that the film never fully shows but that you can feel the shape of into the capacity for what he is doing to these apes. The Colonel made a choice about his son, a choice that the film does not describe in graphic detail but whose nature and weight are completely communicated. He lost something at the center of his own life in a specific and unrepeatable way, and that loss, combined with the fear of what the mutation represents, combined with the military authority he inhabits, combined with the ideology that was always latent in that authority, became the foundation of the compound. The walls, the enslaved apes, the systematic cruelty. Everything here is built on a father's grief, just as Caesar's descent was built on a father's grief. Think about what that means. Think about the film placing these two beings across from each other, a non-human father and a human father, both hollowed out by loss, both having made choices in the aftermath of that loss that have cost them and others enormously, and asking you to find a line between them. The line is there. The film does not pretend the line is not there. Caesar has not done what the Colonel has done, and the film does not equate their choices or their consequences. But it asks you to see, clearly and without comfort, how the same raw material, grief, love, the unbearable sense of having had something essential taken, can be shaped by circumstance and power and ideology into two such different but equally damaged forms. Caesar, after his meeting with the Colonel, returns to the compound population changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but changed in the way that a person is changed when they have looked directly at the thing they were pursuing and found that it was also in some way looking back at them. The desire for revenge does not disappear, but something alongside it has shifted. A new knowledge, a new complexity, a new weight in his understanding of what he is doing here and what it will cost. And it is in this changed state that Caesar begins, with extraordinary difficulty and in the most constrained circumstances imaginable, to behave like a leader again. The underground, the network of tunnels beneath the compound that the apes discover, that becomes the mechanism of their eventual escape, is where the film's middle section finds its most genuine momentum. The tunnels are symbolically everything. The compound above them is not hidden, self organized, built by the imprisoned rather than imposed on them, a structure of survival rather than a structure of control. The ape's secret communication through the compound, the passing of information, the slow building of a collective plan, the way trust functions in a space where trust is the most dangerous thing you can permit yourself, is the film at its most genuinely tense. And it is a tension that works because you have been inside the compound long enough by this point to understand the specific consequences of discovery. The stakes are not abstract, they are the people you have been watching suffer for the past half hour of screen time. Maurice, throughout all of this, remains the film's moral center in a way that is so consistent and so understated that it is easy to overlook how central he actually is. While Caesar has been pursuing vengeance, while the colonel has been pursuing the logic of his particular form of fear driven uncertainty, Maurice has been doing something simpler and more important than either of them. He has been paying attention to the person in front of him. Nova, found alone and silent in the ruins of a life, becomes Maurice's specific responsibility, not because he is asked to take it on, not because it serves any strategic purpose, but because Maurice is the kind of being who, when he sees something small and vulnerable and frightened, does not look away from it. His relationship with Noah is the film's warmth reserve, the place where the human quality of this world is most fully and most reliably present, and it earns its thematic weight because it is entirely consistent with everything Morris has been across three films. He is the orangutan who notices things, who is slow to speak and fast to understand, who holds Caesar's world together at the edges, quietly, without announcement, with the patient persistence of someone who believes that gentleness is not a weakness but a practice, something you choose repeatedly in the face of everything that recommends against it. The arrival of the human military forces, the colonel's superiors, the faction within the human army that has decided the colonel's methods are too extreme even by the standards of a war for species survival, is the film's single most significant structural intervention, and it is also the moment where the film's plotting is at its most clearly mechanical. The human on human military conflict that erupts in the film's final act, the assault on the compound by forces external to anything Caesar has been doing, is narratively convenient in a way that the film does not entirely earn. It solves from outside the characters a problem that the film's internal logic had created. The problem of how Caesar and the surviving apes escape from a situation of total captivity with no obvious means of resistance. The external military assault provides the chaos they need to move, the distraction that converts their captivity from total to partial, the collapse of the compound's a third structure that makes escape possible. All of this works, it works efficiently, and it is visually spectacular, and the action sequence it generates is among the most coherent and most propulsive in the film. But it works too smoothly. It solves the problem too cleanly, and the smoothness of the solution is in slight tension with the film's ambitions, because a film this genuinely interested in the interior cost of survival should find a way to let its characters solve their own most critical problem from within their own resources rather than having the solution arrive from outside. What redeems the structural convenience is what happens to Caesar while the assault is occurring, because in this passage the film reaches the deepest point of its protagonist's arc and the moment that most fully earns the film's final emotional register. Caesar, who has been separated from the escaping apes, who is positioned at the compound's heart when the assault begins, makes a choice in this moment that is the answer to every question the film has been asking about him since its opening. He finds the colonel's quarters, he finds the colonel, and the colonel, the man Caesar came here to face, the man Caesar has been carrying for miles of frozen landscape. The man who killed his family and enslaved his people is dying, not from anything Caesar has done, from the mediation, from the spreading silence, from the very thing the colonel was trying to stop, which has found him the way things that are inevitable always find the people who are most certain they can prevent them. The colonel is sitting in his quarters, alone, and he is losing language, and he is holding something in his hands that makes completely clear what he intends to do with the last of his agency. Caesar stands there with a weapon in his hands. Caesar has every reason, every emotional, every circumstantial, every narrative reason to do the thing he came here to do. The colonel cannot resist him. There would be no practical consequence. The grief, the loss, the miles of cold and dark, it has all arrived at this single point, this single moment of convergence, and the action that would close the circle of revenge is available to Caesar right now with almost no effort. And Caesar does not take it, he almost does. The film is honest about the difficulty of this moment. It is not a clear, immediate moral triumph. Caesar stands there with the weight of everything he has lost, the weapon in his hand, the colonel unable to move, and there is a duration, a real felt duration, not a quick dramatic beat, during which the choice is genuinely open, during which you are not certain what Caesar will do, during which you are not even entirely certain what you want him to do. And then Caesar puts the weapon down. Or rather, and this precision matters enormously, he surrenders the choice to the colonel. He steps back. He allows the colonel the agency to end his own story in the way the colonel has decided it should end, and he leaves. I've thought about this moment more than almost any other single moment in this film, and what I keep returning to is what it costs Caesar to make this choice, and what that cost reveals about what Caesar has become by this point in his journey. The easy reading of the scene is that Caesar chooses mercy, that the better angel of his nature prevails over the desire for revenge, and that the film is affirming the moral value of forgiveness. But I do not think that is quite right. I do not think what Caesar feels in that moment is mercy, exactly. I think it is recognition. I think it is the recognition, painful and unwanted and impossible to unfeel, that killing the colonel would not restore what was lost, would not bring back Blue Eyes or Cornelia, would not fill the space where they lived in him, would not satisfy the thing that sent him across those miles of cold, because the thing that sent him was not really about the colonel at all. It was about his own inability to accept the irreversibility of what had been taken. And you cannot resolve that by finding the person who took it. You can only resolve it by letting go of the belief that resolution was ever available in the form you are seeking it. When Caesar walks away from the colonel, he is not being noble, he is being honest. He is letting go of the story he has been telling himself since the attack on his colony. The story in which pursuing the colonel was a meaningful response to grief, and acknowledging without words, without drama, in the quiet physical language that Serkis has made his signature throughout this trilogy, that the story was never true, that the revenge was never going to be the thing that Hilda won, and that understanding, arriving in that moment, in that room, in that specific confederation of power that has completely inverted since the last time Caesar and the colonel shared a space, is the closest this film comes to genuine catharsis. It is not satisfying in the conventional sense. It does not feel like triumph. It feels like the specific, exhausted, hard-won clarity of someone who has walked a very long way towards something they thought they needed and discovered on arrival that they were wrong about what they needed. That kind of clarity is real. It is the most real thing in the film, and the fact that it arrives not in a moment of dramatic declaration but in the physical act of turning away and walking out of a room is exactly the right choice for this character in this moment. Caesar goes to his people. He helps them escape. He does what he always does in the end. He orients himself toward the survival of the community, toward the path forward, toward the future rather than the past. But he is damaged in the process in a way that the film has been preparing for since its very first frames. In helping the apes escape the compound, in the final exertion of that act, Caesar is wounded. Not dramatically, not with the kind of theatrical injury that blockbuster films typically use to signal a protagonist's sacrifice. He is wounded quietly, in a way that will not kill him immediately, in a way that he can continue through, that he can complete the most important thing with, that he can carry until the carrying is finished. He gets the apes out. He gets them moving. He leads them to the river that borders the compound, to the edge of the territory that has held them captive. And then, and this is the moment, he stops. He stops at the river's edge because he knows he cannot cross it, not because of the wound entirely, though the wound is part of it, but because of something else, something that the film has been suggesting since Caesar's interior collapse began, and that arrives here as physical fact. Caesar has used himself up. He has given everything: his grief, his anger, his love, his leadership, his willingness to endure what cannot be endured. And what is left is not enough to carry him forward into the new world his people are crossing into. He can lead them to it. He cannot enter it with them. The apes cross the river. They look back at Caesar at the bank, at the figure who has been their center and their North Star for 3 films of accumulated love and loss and loyalty, and Caesar looks back at them. And Cornelius, his surviving son, the youngest, the child who was born at the beginning of dawn and who has never known a world without war, crosses back briefly, unable to simply leave his father behind. And what passes between them in this moment is not dialogue and not drama. It is love in its most stripped and essential form, the love between a parent and a child, the specific quality of that love in the moment where the parent knows they will not be there for what comes next, and the child knows it too, and neither of them has language sufficient for what that means. Caesar tells Cornelius to go, not in those words, but in the specific physical language of a father releasing a child into a future the father cannot share, and Cornelius goes. And Caesar is alone at the river's edge as his people, his entire people, everyone he has led and protected and fought for, and nearly destroyed himself over, disappear into the green world on the other side. The film then cuts to Caesar, sitting against a tree in the forest on the near side of the river, alone, in the light, the wound doing what wounds do, and Serkis's face in this final extended close-up is doing something that I find almost impossible to describe accurately, which is itself a form of tribute to what he achieves here. It is not simply grief, though there is grief. It is not simply peace, though there is something that resembles peace. It is not resignation, because resignation implies defeat, and what this face communicates is not defeat, it is completion. It is the face of a being at the end of something that was genuinely complete, a life that reached the boundary of what it was meant to do and stopped there, at that boundary, having done it. There is something in the set of Scissors' face in those final frames that I can only describe as unrest. The kind of rest that is not available to you until you have finished, truly finished the thing you were here to finish. And Caesar has finished it. He got them there. He will not go, but he got them there. The film ends on the new land, on the apes arriving at the place that has been the destination since the film's beginning, a vast, beautiful, sun-warmed valley with water and trees and the kind of space that a new beginning requires. Mardis is there. Rocket is there. Bad Ape is there. Nova is there. Cornelius is there. And they stop at the edge of this place and look at it. And what they are looking at is not just a landscape. They are looking at everything Caesar lived and fought and suffered and finally released for. They are looking at what his death made possible. And the film allows itself, in these final frames, the one thing it has been withholding across its entire running time: genuine beauty. Real, saturated, warm, open beauty. Color returning to a world that has been grey since its opening frame. Light falling on a new world in the specific quality that light falls when something has finally arrived. There are no post-credit scenes in War for the Planet of the Apes. The film trusts its final image completely, trusts that what it has shown you is sufficient, that it does not need to gesture toward what comes next, that the new world beginning beyond that final frame can remain implied rather than illustrated. This is the right choice. It is the choice that a film genuinely confident in the emotional weight of its conclusion makes. The choice to stop when the story is complete, to resist the franchise imperative of the tease or the setup, to let the last image be the last image and trust the audience to carry it forward themselves. what foreshadowing, looking back, was placed earlier in the film that only fully reveals itself after the ending. Several threads, and each one deepens the experience of the film if you carry it back to the beginning with you. The recurring motif of Caesar looking at reflections, which I described in our earlier movement, accumulates a new meaning after the ending. What Caesar was seeing in those distorted reflections was not simply his fractured self. He was seeing, without knowing it, the glimpsed shape of his own ending, a version of himself that existed outside the frame of the future his people were walking into. Every distorted reflection was a quiet subliminal preparation for the film's final image, the way great films prepare you for their endings from their very first moments without your being consciously aware of the preparation. The flowers. There are small moments scattered through the film's middle passages where Nova holds flowers or where flowers appear in the background of frames that have otherwise been stripped of anything living or beautiful. And these moments are so brief and so peripheral that most viewers do not consciously register. But they are preparing the color palette of the film's final frames. They are saying, in the visual grammar of a film that has deliberately drained color from its world, beauty is not gone. It is held in reserve. It is waiting on the other side of what must be endured first. When the valley floods the final frames with warmth and green and light, the flowers you did not quite consciously see throughout the film suddenly make their full meaning available. The beauty was always there. It was just waiting. The specific quality of light in the film's final moments connects back with devastating precision to the quality of light in the very first memory Caesar has, the memories that rise in him across this film and the preceding two, of the home in San Francisco where he was raised, of the warmth and safety of a life before loss. The ending gives Caesar in his final moments a light that resembles that original light. The new word and the original word rhyme visually in a way that suggests something the film never states directly. That what Caesar was always building toward was not simply a future for his people, but a recovery of something that had been lost at the very beginning, a world where apes could live in the quality of safety and warmth that Caesar himself was only ever able to experience briefly before the world took it from him. He did not live to enter that world, but he lived to see it arrive for the ones he loved. And in the specific visual language of how Harrelson photographs those final frames, in the warmth of that light, in the fullness of that color, there is a suggestion, quiet and unforced and entirely light, that what Caesar sees in those final moments is not just the valley his people are walking into. It is a recognition, it is a coming to rest in the light he always remembered. That is what this film leaves you with. That is the last frame, a father at rest in familiar light, having finished the thing he was here to finish while his children walk into the world he made possible. It is not a happy ending. It is something rarer and more honest than that. It is a true ending, an ending that costs something real and gives something real simultaneous, that holds grief and hope in the same image without resolving the tension between them, that trusts you to carry both forward without the film explaining to you how. Whether the film fully earned this ending across every minute of its running time, whether the path to those final frames was as complete and as immersive as the frames themselves, I have already been honest about my reservations. But the ending itself, the specific quality of what the film arrives at in its last 10 minutes, in Caesar's last moments, in that specific quality of earned light, that I think is real. That is cinema doing something that only cinema can do, finding the image that contains the feeling, holding it on screen long enough for the feeling to transfer, and then trusting the darkness of the theater and the person sitting in it to do the rest. There is a moment that happens after certain films, not all films, not even most films, but certain ones, where the credits begin to roll and you do not move. Not because you are thinking about what you just watched, not because you are analyzing or processing or reaching for the language that will let you describe the experience to someone else later, but because something in you needs a moment to simply be inside what the film left behind before the ordinary word comes back in. The film has done something to the air around you, to the specific quality of your awareness, and you are not quite ready to give that back yet. War for the Planet of the Apes gave me one of those moments. Not a long one, not the kind of sustained, overwhelming stillness that the greatest films produce, the kind where you genuinely cannot speak for minutes afterward, where the return to the ordinary world feels like a small bereavement, but a real one, a genuine pause. A moment of sitting in the dark after Caesar's final image had faded, with a specific weight of what this trilogy had been and what it had just finished, and feeling the particular combination of grief and gratitude that only art can produce, the feeling of having been given something that simultaneously cost you something, and being grateful for both. I want to be honest about that moment because it is the truest thing I can tell you about my relationship with this film. For all the reservations I have named across this essay, the pacing hesitations, the structure tensions, the tonal miscalibrations, the ways the film falls short of the greatness the best work of its trilogy reached, none of those reservations were present in that moment after the credits began. In that moment, there was only the weight of it. The specific, irreplaceable, entirely untheoretical weight of having spent time with Caesar across three films and now being on the other side of his story, of knowing how it ended, of carrying that knowledge forward into a world where the films continue to exist and can be returned to, but where that particular quality of not yet knowing is gone forever and can never be recovered. That is what this film left behind in me, and I have been sitting with it ever since. The single moment I keep returning to, the image that has not left me across all the viewings and all the thinking and all the writing I have done about this film, is not the most dramatic moment in the film. It is not the most technically upnished, not the most thematically loaded, not the moment that carries the most explicit narrative weight. It is a small moment, and it occurs in the film's final sequence, and if you blinked at the wrong instant, you might have missed it entirely. It is the moment where Cornelius Caesar's youngest son, the child who has grown up inside the war and never known anything outside it, crosses back from the river's far bank to where his father is sitting. He crosses back not because anything useful can happen there. He crosses back because he cannot simply leave. He stands near his father for a moment, and Caesar's hand finds the child's face with the specific, unhurried tenderness of a parent making sure of something, making sure that the face is real, that the child is present, that this moment is actually happening, and not simply something he has been imagining through the long, cold months of everything that preceded it. And then he lets go, and Cornelius goes. I keep returning to that touch, that hand on that face, the specific economy of it, how much it contains in how few frames, how much love it transmits without a single word, how completely it communicates both the bond and the release simultaneously. It is the whole film in a gesture. It is what Caesar has always been. Beneath every political and mythological and historical dimension, the story has layered over him. A father, loving his children in the specific and irreducible way that parents love children, which is to say, with a love that has always contained within it the knowledge that it is preparing them to exist without you. Every parent who has ever let a child go into adulthood, into the world, into the futures that belong to the children rather than the ones who made them, will recognize that gesture. It is not specific to apes or humans or any particular species or culture or century. It is the oldest love there is. And Andy Serkis, through the mediation of cameras and computers and the extraordinary infrastructure of Weta Digital's technology, transmits it with a purity and a completeness that I find genuinely extraordinary. Did this film change how I see something? I think it did, though the change is subtle and not easily articulated. It changed how I think about the relationship between revenge and grief, or more precisely, it gave me a more nuanced understanding of why we tend to confuse them. Before sitting with this film as carefully as I have, I think I understood revenge as a moral failure, as the choice that a person makes when they let their worst instincts override their better judgment. What this film gave me, through Caesar's specific arc, is a more honest accounting. The desire for revenge that Caesar carries is not a moral failure. It is a comprehensible and even, in a strange way, loving response to loss. The failure, if there is one, is not in the feeling. It is in the belief that acting on the feeling will resolve the feeling. Caesar learns at enormous cost that the source of his fame is not located in the kernel. It never was. It is located in the irreversibility of what was taken, and you cannot reverse that. You can only eventually let it be true. Let it be the unchangeable fact it is, and choose from within that acceptance how you will live alongside it. That understanding, which the film communicates not through argument but through the accumulated experience of watching Caesar carry and then release his grief across an entire film's running time, is something I have thought about in contexts that have nothing to do with Caesar or the Apes franchise. It transferred. Realism always does. Would I return to this film? Yes, I already have. Not obsessively. It does not have the quality of the films I return to simply because being inside them is pleasurable, the way you return to a piece of music you love. I return to it the way you return to a conversation that you know you did not fully understand the first time, with the sense that there is more available in it than you were able to receive on the previous encounter, and that some portion of that additional meaning will become available this time because you are bringing more to it. Each viewing gives me something different. On the first viewing, the emotional impact of the losses was primary. On subsequent viewings, the craft, the visual language, the performance nuances, the symbolic architecture comes forward more clearly. And on the most recent viewing, the thing that most commanded my attention was the film's extraordinary patience with silence, the way it trusts the image and the performance to carry weight that most films would prop up with score or dialogue, and the specific courage that kind of trust requires from a filmmaker working within the constraints of mainstream franchise production. The person who will carry this film most deeply is not, I think, the person who comes to it primarily for spectacle, though there is spectacle and it is extraordinary. The person who will carry this film most deeply is the person who has experienced, either in their own life or in the lives of people they love, the specific weight of leading others through something that is costing you privately more than you are permitted to show. The person who understands from the inside what it means to be the one who must remain oriented toward the future when the future is the last thing you feel capable of facing. The person who has sat at the edge of their own private river, at the boundary between the life they were living and the life that is available on the other side of their grief, and understood that the crossing might not be available to them in the same form it is available to the ones they are responsible for. This film will mean something specific and lasting to that person. It will feel in the way that the best films feel, like being recognized, like the specific quality of your experience being seen and named and held with care. The person who may not fully connect with War for the Planet of the Apes is the person who came for the title. The person who saw the word war and the marketing campaign and expected the kind of kinetic, propulsive, large-scale action narrative that the summer blockbuster format promises, and that the previous two films in the trilogy, for all their seriousness, delivered more consistently. There is no shame in that expectation. It was the expectation the marketing created, and the marketing was not entirely honest about what the film actually is. If you arrive at this film wanting energy and momentum and the forward rushing satisfaction of a story that moves with urgency, you will find those things in passages, in the compound escape sequence, in the opening attack, in the film's final military confrontation. But you will spend significant stretches of the running time in a register that is quieter, more internal, more interested in the texture of endurance than the experience of forward momentum. Know that before you arrive. Let the film be what it is, rather than what the posters suggested, and you will find something worth the patience. As for how you should watch it, I think the answer is unambiguous. If you have not seen Rise and Dawn, see them first. See them in order, with sufficient time between them that each film can settle properly before the next one begins. The trilogy is a single extended work of sustained emotional investment, and each film depends on the accumulated weight of the ones that preceded it. War without Rise and Dawn is a competent and beautifully made film. War with Rise and Dawn is the conclusion of a relationship. A three-film relationship with a character who has been given to you gradually, carefully, with enormous generosity and craft, and whose ending arrives carrying everything you have been given. See it that way. See it in the cinema if you can. The scale of the images, the depth of Giacchino's score in a proper sound environment, the visual language of Saracens and anamorphic frames on a large screen, all of it rewards the full theatrical experience. If the cinema is not available, find the largest screen and the best sound environment you have access to, and give the film the space it was made for. And if you have already seen all three, if you are here because you have lived with this trilogy and want to understand your own experience of it more fully, then I think what this essay has been reaching for, across every movement and every argument and every honest accounting of what this film does and does not achieve, is this: War for the Planet of the Apes is a film that tried something genuinely important, executed it with remarkable craft and real emotionalism, fell short of its own highest ambitions in specific and nameable ways, and led by it for and spite fitty pine fangs something that you carry. Something that surfaces in moments that have nothing to do with cinema, in the specific quality of a loss, in the impulse toward revenge that you recognize without being able to prevent, in the moment of standing at your own private river's edge and understanding that some crossings are not yours to make. The film put those things in you, and they are yours now, and the fact that the film that gave them to you was imperfect does not diminish them. My rating for War for the Planet of the Apes is 5.8 out of 10, and I want to earn that number before I let it stand, because a number without honesty behind it is just a number. The 5.8 is not a dismissal. It is not the verdict of someone who watched this film without care or without generosity. It is the honest assessment of someone who brought everything to this film that it asked for, who gave it its full running time, its full emotional attention, its full benefit of the doubt across every passage where the doubt was genuinely present, and who found on the other side of all of that a film that is genuinely excellent in parts and genuinely uneven in others, and whose unevenness is consequential enough to hold it meaningfully short of the greatness it was reaching for. The 5.8 honors the reach. It honors the craft. It honors Andy Serkis and Matt Reeves and Michael Giacchino and the hundreds of artists at Veta Digital and on location in British Columbia and Iceland who gave this film everything they had. It honors the emotional truth of the final sequence and the genuine wisdom of the film's central moral argument. And it is honest about the pacing hesitations, the tonal miscalibrations, the structural tensions, the ways the compound sequences do not accumulate the pressure the ending needs them to accumulate. The 5.8 says, "This is a very good film that wanted to be a great one, and the wanting is visible in every frame, and the wanting itself is something worth respecting. Not every film that falls short of greatness is worth sitting with. This one is. The last shot of a great film tends to be simple. The last shot of a great film tends to be an image that could not exist without everything that preceded it, and that contains within itself, quietly and without announcement, the entire emotional truth of what the film has been. War for the Planet of the Apes does not end on its greatest shot. The shot is Sarkis's face in those final close-ups, the earned rest in the light, the completion arriving without fanfare. But the last image it leaves you with, the new world, the valley, the apes walking into the light, is the right image. It is the answer to the question that Trilogy has been asking since its birth frame. What is a civilization? What is a species? What is worth building? What is worth protecting? What is worth carrying across impossible distances through impossible cold, at impossible cost, with no guarantee of arrival? This is the answer. This valley, these people, this light, this beginning that was only possible because someone loved it enough to exhaust himself entirely in its service and step back from the threshold so that it could begin. That answer is quiet. It does not announce itself. It simply stands there in the light and waits for you to feel it. Some fins shake you, some fins comfort you, some fins change the temperature of the room you are watching them in. War for the Planet of the Apes does something slightly different and slightly rarer. It makes you aware in its best moments of the specific weight of what love costs, and of why the cost is worth paying, and of what it means to exhaust yourself entirely in the service of something larger than your own survival. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. It is more than most films manage. It is more than this film sometimes manages. But in the moments when it manages it, in the gestures and the silences and the specific quality of that final light, it manages it completely, and that is enough. Sometimes enough is the truest form of praise available. Thank you for being here for this one. I mean that sincerely. This essay asked for something from both of us. It asks you to sit with a long and careful argument about a film that defies easy summary, and it asked me to be honest rather than simply enthusiastic or simply critical, which is always the harder path. If this essay gave you something, a new way of thinking about this film, a new appreciation for what the performance capture work achieved, a deeper understanding of why Caesar's arc resonates the way it does even when the film around it is imperfect, then it was worth every word. I would genuinely love to know what you think. Not just what you think of the film, though that too, but what you think about the specific question the film raises and never quite answers directly. Is the cost of leadership always this? Is the person who leads others to the threshold of the new world always, by the nature of what leadership requires, the one who cannot cross it with them? Leave that in the comments. I will be reading. I want to know where you land on it. And if you have thoughts about the trilogy as a whole, about where war sits relative to Rise and Dawn, about whether the three films together achieve something that none of them achieves individually, about whether Andy Serkis deserved the formal recognition that the awards circuit withheld, bring those too. The conversation in the comments of this channel is always one of the best things about making these essays, and conversations about films like this one. Films that are genuinely trying at something worth trying are the ones worth having. If you have not yet subscribed to the Cine Flux, this is what we do here. Every essay, every film, this quality of attention, this depth of engagement, this commitment to treating cinema as the serious and extraordinary art form it is. If that is what you are looking for, if you want a place where films are felt before they are measured and understood before they are judged, then subscribe. Hit the notification bell if you want to know the moment the next essay arrives. And if this essay gave you something, share it with someone who loves cinema the way you do. These essays find their best audience through the people who already understand what they are. The next essay on the Cine Flux is going to take us somewhere very different, a film that operates at the opposite end of the emotional spectrum from this one, quieter in some ways and louder in others, asking entirely different questions about what cinema can do when it strips everything back to its most essential elements. I'm genuinely excited about that one. I think it is going to surprise you. Until then, take care of the films you love, take care of the people you watch them with, and remember that every frame of every film you have ever felt something inside was made by human beings who cared imperfectly and completely about the thing they were making. That caring is worth honoring, even when, especially when the result falls short of what the caring was reaching for. That is the Cine Flux. I will see you in the next one.